I was wondering if you could talk a little bit or introduce the global color line.
So Du Bois in 1900, he attends the Pan-African Conference in London, and he's involved with a few other figures who make this statement at the end of the conference that includes the line, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker races to the lighter races, you know, and it's a quote or a statement that reappears again in his 1903 Souls of Black Folk. So, I think especially for audiences who will be familiar with American history, the idea of the color line or Jim Crow will be familiar as this kind of experience of formal segregation, right? Whites only schools and segregated public accommodations, so forth. So the color line or the color bar was associated with a kind of legal forms of segregation, racial segregation. What Du Bois is doing in these kind of in his articulation of a global color line is disassociating that story of racial segregation from a purely legalistic or formal structure of racial segregation, and also globalizing it, right? So what he's saying is like, in fact, the experience in the United States of Jim Crow is part of a wider structure of global white supremacy. And we can't really understand the dynamics of the United States without kind of situating it in this wider context of imperial expansion around the world in the late 19th century.
Yeah, he was like theorizing a perspective on global power relations. It was not a perfect concept, though, right? Like you guys noted how it had blind spots. What were the blind spots?
It's both a kind of analytic, right? It's a way of theorizing power relations, as you were saying, and revealing something about the world that was obscured when we focus, say, on states as the primary agents of international order. It's also a political vision, right? So if the world is structured by a color line, Du Bois imagines a counterpart. There's a counterpart to that story, which is that it's supposed to produce forms of racial solidarity, Pan-Africanism, but also what he calls by the 1930s, the union of color, right? Bringing together all the darker races in solidarity and in struggle against white supremacy. Now, as we note in the introduction, and also you can see it in the essays, I mean, this analytic can obscure other dynamics of domination on the global stage. So our two clearest examples of this in the essays is Du Bois's writings on Liberia. Liberia is a West African country founded in part by former slaves from the United States who settled and were resettled in Liberia. And there was always this kind of settler and indigenous conflict that structured that politics, that structured that state. So, but the color line as thinking about all of the people, whether they were the Americo-Liberians, as they were frequently called, or indigenous peoples in Liberia, I mean, from the perspective of the color line, they're all Black, right? But there's ways in which his kind of writing about Liberia obscures this kind of dynamic of internal conflict, or minimizes that to elevate and focus on the forms of domination and exploitation Liberia suffers as what he calls a Black poor country. I mean, a similar issue happens around the question of Japanese empire. And there it's even much more striking, because it's not just a kind of inattention to or neglect of this question of kind of intra-racial subordination, but a kind of defense of Japanese empire as a kind of countervailing power, as a non-white power. And I think in many ways the concept of the color line, Du Bois used it to very generative uses, and I think it was productive for that period. But it's also kind of has no way, or it didn't really have ways to think about race making that didn't necessarily work alongside a kind of light, dark, white, black set of binary. So, scholars of the Japanese Empire would say, yeah, the Japanese Empire was a racial empire. It had a racial theory about Japanese supremacy, but it's not one that's necessarily organized around whiteness in the same kinds of ways.